Welcome to Marketplace Tech Bytes, our weekly review of the biggest stories making headlines across the industry. I'm Lily Dramali. This week on the show, music labels take AI startups to court. The Supreme Court sides with the White House in a major social media censorship case. And NVIDIA's rising stock takes a nosedive. Joining me this week is Anita Ramaswamy with The Information. Hey, Anita.
Hey, Lily.
A newbie to San Francisco. How is it treating you so far?
I'm loving the West Coast.
That's exactly what we want to hear. Stay with us. Stay here. Anytime you leave home, by the way, this is my advice to you now that you live there, always bring a sweater and you'll thank me later.
Oh, absolutely. It's all about the layering.
All about the layering, especially as we go into the summer, quote unquote, summer months. Doesn't feel like summer there. Let's start with our bite of the week. This is a number that says a little something about the week that was in tech. Anita, what have you been thinking about this week?
I've been thinking about AI in the creative arts. And so my number of the week is 8. And that is the number of newspapers, which I guess, still falls under the general umbrella of somewhat creative work. And the 8 newspapers sued OpenAI in April in a lawsuit about copyright infringement. And that followed, a similar lawsuit from the New York Times, from The Intercept. There's plenty of, musical artists. There's plenty of journalists. There's plenty of newsrooms, people who are creating content who are pretty upset about the use of AI and their work in training AI models.
Indeed. And you mentioned music. A group of music labels, including Sony, Universal, and Warner Music Group, are suing this week 2 generative AI startups, Suno and Udio. These companies work specifically in the area of AI-generated music. The accusation here is that these companies used copyrighted works scraped from the internet to train their AI models. We've seen this movie before. Here's a sample courtesy of comedian King Wallonius, who created a song sampled by producer Metro Boomin. BBL Drizzy is the song, which apparently insults the rapper Drake. Let's listen.
BBL Drizzy, BBL Drizzy.
All right, so we get a little taste of that. What has been your read on this case, Anita? Because as you noted, it's coming on the heels of this flurry of lawsuits, pretty similar ones throughout this past couple of months.
Yeah, well, for starters, I am Team Kendrick, so just throwing that out there. But in terms of the copyright disputes, it's really interesting because, like I mentioned, it's not just, Suno and Udio that got sued. The similar things happened with OpenAI. That's working its way through the courts. There's another startup, Perplexity, which does AI-powered search. And they also were facing some accusations on social media earlier this month about whether or not they had improperly scraped articles that were basically paywalled and then used them to train the AI model. And so there's a lot of tension just between anyone who creates any type of content and these AI companies about whether or not it constitutes a fair use of that data. A lot of times you can use some data that you scrape from the internet if you're an academic or you're a researcher and you're using it for teaching purposes. Mm-hmm. And so broadly, a lot of these AI startups are sort of defending their practices, saying that, hey, this is a fair use. And this is a chatbot that's available to the general public in the case of ChatGPT. At the same time, as a creator, I can imagine why there's some frustration on that. And it's going to take a really long time, I think, before we actually see a resolution as to, where this falls legally.
And in the meantime, it seems like, Anita, that creatives are kind of in a holding pattern here. People who want to protect their work, their original work that they made.
Yeah, absolutely. Some are embracing it too, which is the other interesting flip side of it. Thrive Capital, the VC firm, my colleague Kate Clark reported yesterday that they took a big investment in the film studio A24. And, that's really interesting. Like we saw all these big major films from A24. And part of the reason Thrive said that they were investing is because they want to help incorporate AI into A24's movies. And so only time will tell, is this going to be, we're going to see entirely AI generated franchises that end up being multi-billion-dollar films, or are we just going to see AI used to sort of supplement and augment and make some of the scenes cooler and make them more robust?
You're right. We shall see. Well, thank you for all the great insights there. And we're going to stick with legal news for our next topic. The Supreme Court on Wednesday sided with the Biden administration, ruling 6-3 in a legal dispute with Republican-led states. This case was all about how far the federal government can go to combat controversial social media posts on topics like COVID-19 and election security. Anita, what do you make of this decision, which we should note is a reversal of a lower court ruling?
I think that at the end of the day, it just puts a little bit of accountability almost back onto the social media platforms, kind of saying that they have the right and, perhaps societally an obligation to combat things like misinformation. It's surprising, just because, there was so much controversy around the, different things posted about COVID and about election security. And, given the political leanings of the current Supreme Court, that this ended up shaking out on the side of the Biden administration. And I think it's just going to go to show that these social media platforms need to do whatever they can to try and avoid, the perception that they're biased in some way. But it's a tough spot for them to be in, too.
Yeah. And I also just wanted to point out, on the one hand, there's been quite a bit of rare bipartisanship on the tech stories, the issues of the day. But this issue of censorship seems to be one of the exceptions to that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, even the use of the word censorship, because, there are some folks who see it that way. There are other folks who see it as, these are private companies, they're tech platforms, they should be able to say what belongs and doesn't belong on their platform. So it's all a matter of perspective.
Yes, even using that term is very charged. So I'm glad you mentioned that. All right, well, on to our third and final story. NVIDIA stock taking a nosedive, falling as much as 13% from its highs at one point this week. It has recovered some of its losses since. A reminder, Anita, that NVIDIA stock was up more than 1,000% since late 2022. So it was really leading the euphoria in AI stocks. And I think what everyone is kind of thinking about right now is, if you're following this space, are we in a market correction now for this subsector of tech? And what are you hearing?
I don't think that we're quite in a correction just yet, but NVIDIA stock is the most closely watched in the entire world right now. I mean, last week they briefly became the world's most valuable company and then sort of fell, since that. And I think that investors are still really excited about AI, but also just starting to get nervous and understanding that maybe some of the gains, like the incredible things that people in Silicon Valley talk about, might not come anytime soon. And it might take several years until we get there. So NVIDIA selling the chips that are essentially fueling this entire artificial intelligence boom, I mean, they're sort of a bellwether for the rest of the market. So I don't think I'm ready to call it, a full correction yet, but I think it is a little bit of investors trying to understand, okay, where exactly are our expectations and how long is it going to take for, AI to take off?
Absolutely. Well, let's zoom out a little bit to what's going on among other AI companies. You've been looking at this week at Databricks and Snowflake, two rivals that specialize in storing and managing massive amounts of data. These are companies with billion-dollar plus valuations at this point. They don't get the attention that NVIDIA does, of course. First of all, what prompted you to look into this part of the AI ecosystem this week?
I just thought it was really interesting that, I heard a lot of people in the tech community, engineers, developers talking about these companies, but I didn't really hear them in the mainstream discourse. And so they are really important parts of the AI ecosystem. Like at the end of the day, you're feeding data into the AI models, and the data is sort of the most important part if you want to have these models that work. And so I just thought to myself, I've heard these names thrown around so many times. I don't really know what these companies actually do. And so I wanted to start with the perspective of understanding their business models, really unpacking those and trying to, come to a point of view on, is Databricks worth 43 billion, which is what they got in their last private valuation from their venture backers. They also might be preparing to go public soon. And, the IPO markets have been moving really slow. So that would be a really interesting one to watch if Databricks does end up making that decision this year, because it will really show, what is the sentiment and also where is the value that AI is creating actually accruing to? Is it going to be the NVIDIAs of the world that make the chips? Is it going to be the companies like Databricks and Snowflake that store the data? Is it going to be Microsoft, which has an investment in OpenAI that makes the model itself? Or is it going to be apps that are just powered by the models? I think it's really interesting to sort of unpack the different parts of AI and what we actually mean when we say AI as a term.
That's so important. I mean, what were your big takeaways? What do you think investors are missing then, big picture, about this tier of AI companies that are not named NVIDIA and don't deal in the chips part of that ecosystem or supply chain? They deal in the storage and memory space more.
So NVIDIA is really well positioned, of course, but the other companies that are really well positioned in AI right now are the big tech players. And I'm talking specifically about Microsoft, Alphabet. I would maybe even add Meta to that list. Whereas Databricks and Snowflake, I mean, they're smaller companies compared to those tech giants, and their rivalry has been really closely watched. It's always been this thing of like, okay, Databricks versus Snowflake, who's going to win the fight? And what I argued in my column is that I think that the bigger picture is actually, it's not going to matter so much about the two versus each other. What's going to matter is, can the big tech players like Microsoft replicate what they're doing and do it better and, attract customers away from them?
Yeah, there's a lot of big inclination to draw the, sort of the parallels to a Apple Microsoft rivalry. I think you need to have some characters to front the two companies at some point, and maybe we'll learn more about who runs these companies and what their personalities are like as we keep staying on these stories. Well, we're absolutely not done talking about AI stocks. We're going to be revisiting this in our coverage in the coming weeks. Anita Ramaswamy of The Information, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Lily.
All right. Thanks to all of you for watching Marketplace Tech Bytes Week in Review. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to us. We are at Marketplace APM. Daniel Shin produced this week's episode, and I'm Lily Jamali. This is APM.